Hello, it's good to be with you all today. My name is John Lustrea. I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Happy Monday to all of you watching with us live, and happy whatever day you're watching us on if you're not watching this live. Again, my name is John Lustrea, Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and today we're going to be talking about medical care at the Battle of Pea Ridge. We're doing this live on the 159th anniversary of the Battle of Pea Ridge. So it's quite timely to be talking about this. I see we've already got some folks tuning in the comments. Jan from Orlando, Florida, Eddie McDevitt from Annapolis, Marcella from Indiana, Tim from upstate New York, Gary, Ellicott City, Maryland, good old Ryan from Colorado, Scott from Bensalem, Pennsylvania, outside Philly, Barbara. Thank you all for tuning in so far. Appreciate you commenting and letting us know where you're watching from. Get started here in just a little bit. I want to give people time to get on the stream, and B, thank you all for tuning in, and let us know how you can support the museum and more videos like this. For one thing, something everyone can do, it's free, doesn't cost anybody anything. Just hit the like button and the share button. Those help more people see the video and join in and all that. So that's immensely helpful. And we appreciate those of you that have been liking and sharing, and even consider tagging a friend that you know would enjoy this. So that's one way you can help. The other way is to, if you want to take it, one more step, is to become a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. People signing up to become members goes directly to supporting programs like this. We've been doing these throughout the year, and we're coming up on 1 year since we've been producing regular video content. And all the people who have joined as a member, who've been watching the videos throughout the year, or maybe only one or two here and there, have helped us so much. I'm going to post the link in the comments. Support the museum by becoming a member for as low as $25 a year. And you can support for more than that if you would like, but that's our lowest level. It's just a few dollars a month. So we appreciate to all who have signed up so far. Another way that you can help us, this is another free way you can help. If you haven't liked the museum on Facebook, you can do that, and that helps further boost our numbers. Follow us across all social media channels, whether that's subscribing to us on YouTube, following us on Twitter and Instagram. We're everywhere. We even have a Reddit page. So we're all across the web. So following us everywhere, that helps us immensely as well. I see we got a number of people tuning in still. We got about 70 of us here. Let's see, Paula from Millbrook, New York, Rose from Springfield, Illinois. Excellent. Thank you so much for joining. And I'm just finally getting that membership link in the comments there. Okay. And I think I saw someone is watching here from Kuwait, if you can believe it. Where'd that go? Carlo, yes, welcome from Kuwait. That's a ways away. We're glad you're with us. Aunt Connie and Uncle Bob watching near Richmond. Rick has been to the Battle of Pea Ridge, the national park site there, and he's from Springfield, Missouri. And Springfield, Missouri will come up a little bit later in the program. Got Frank from South Carolina, San from Alabama, people from all over the country and the world. So it's wonderful. Let's see, Carolyn says, greetings from Bel Air, Kansas. And the first time I went to Pea Ridge, I was 10 years old. Excellent. I have also been to Pea Ridge. I visited the Park Service site out there in Arkansas when I was in middle school. That was a really, really fun trip. I went both there and to Wilson's Creek in the same trip with my dad. That was a fun trip. I'd highly recommend going to both sites if you can. I should note, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the program here. If you have any questions at all, go ahead and drop them in the comments during the presentation. I'm going to share my screen here and go through a PowerPoint. So while I'm doing that, I won't be able to see your comments. So if you have a question and I just sail right past it and I don't address it at all, that's why. It's because I can't see it right away, but I will come back to it at the end of the program. So stand by on that. So all that said, let's go ahead and get this started here. I'll bring up the PowerPoint. Okay, and there we are. And there's a, you see in the background there, a quite popular image, post-war painting of the Battle of Pea Ridge, probably a lot more kind of neat and clean than the battle was itself. And I'm certain I'll probably get some questions about this. You can actually see on this, this picture, there are some Native Americans, I believe Cherokees, who served with the Confederacy at the Battle of Pea Ridge. And that was, there are a handful of battles in the Civil War where Native Americans fight primarily on the side of the Confederacy, which, you know, of course, is sort of an interesting thing to think about, you know, given that, you know, part of what you know, the Confederacy is pushing is to continue the legacy of slavery in the country, but Native Americans to this point had enough dealings with the federal government to be deeply suspicious of it. And even if the Confederacy wasn't necessarily a paragon of freedom, it was at least not the known quantity that was known to be bad, at least in terms of those relations. So that's what you're looking at there. Now, Pea Ridge. What exactly is this battle? Where is this battle? Why are they fighting there? And all of that. We'll cover all of that before we get to the medical response to the battle itself. Well, Pea Ridge, as I mentioned, is in Arkansas. It's barely in Arkansas. It's directly above what you see there. Just immediately to the north is the state of Missouri. And this is just a handful of miles, you know, less than 20 miles into the state of Arkansas. And so the Battle of Pea Ridge is fought in the early days of March 6th through 8 in 1862. By the end of February, Union forces had pretty much cleared Missouri and portions of northwest Arkansas of Confederate troops. Thanks to maneuverings of some skirmishes here and there, this kind of began with the Wilson's Creek campaign in August of 1861, which I talked about back in August of 2020. If you're interested in hearing me talk about medicine at the Battle of Wilson's Creek, you can go back on our Facebook page and YouTube channel and check that out. And I should note, someone emailed me ahead of time asking, you know, maybe you have to leave early or you tune in late. These videos will be available. This video will be available on our Facebook page and eventually the YouTube channel after we're done here. So never fear. So beginning, you know, with the Wilson's Creek campaign in August of 1861, Union forces had been slowly pushing and maneuvering and angling Confederate troops out of the state of Missouri. And they were continuing the push down through Arkansas in an effort to kind of maintain access to, well, territory, you know, farmland and resources of that nature, access to rivers, you know, holding St. Louis was a very important objective for the Union Army. So there's some strategic value to occupying this territory. So in an effort, so the Union forces, Union Army under the command of General Samuel Curtis had his army stationed in the Pea Ridge area. And it was, you know, they were kind of waiting to plan their next move from there. And so to prevent this further push south by the Union forces, Confederate General Earl Van Dorn, who you see there on the left, there's Union General Samuel Curtis on the right. Confederate General Earl Van Dorn took the offensive in an effort to you know, not allow the Union Army to continue dictating the pace of the push southward. And the hope was that the Confederates would, regain all of Arkansas and establish a foothold in Missouri, and ideally keep moving further north to some degree. Now, the Confederate Army totals about 16,500 soldiers. The Union Army about 10,500. This is one of the few battles of the Civil War where Confederates actually outnumber the Union forces. You don't see that very often. And the Battle of Pea Ridge will produce somewhere around 4,000 combined casualties. So we're talking about approximately 27,000 combined troops participating in the battle, and about 4,000 combined casualties or so, skewing more heavily toward the Confederate casualties, about 2,500 for the South and 1,300 for the North, roughly. These are all ballpark figures here. And this is something that's kind of important to note. With some of the earlier battles of the Civil War, especially ones on the far west, far western frontier, yes, if you can believe it, Arkansas, which is sort of, in the south central United States, that was more or less the western frontier at the time of the Civil War. So if you hear me talk about the West and you're sitting there thinking to yourself, but John, you're talking about Arkansas, there's nothing west about Arkansas. West in the context of the 19th century United States. Some of the earlier battles, especially in the far western theater, the numbers of participants were quite low. So even though there had been hardship after battles, an unanticipated number of casualties in those early days, the numbers hadn't been shocking to the nation yet. I mean, by this point in early 1862, the war had gone on longer than many thought it might, but the nation hadn't been truly shocked by the bloody battles that will come to, when we think of Civil War battles, we think of large casualty list battles like Gettysburg and Antietam and things of this nature. Battles like that, there are larger total participants, and so there's just more people that can possibly become casualties. The Battle of Gettysburg had somewhere close to 200,000 participants. This battle, Battle of Pea Ridge, is about a tenth of that. So the total numbers are just smaller, which is part of the reason why it gets talked about less. And the other part of the reason is how far west it was relative to much of the other wartime action. This will all change about a month later with the Battle of Shiloh, which I'll be coming on to do a live stream to talk about that when we get there for the anniversary. That's in early April. I can't remember the date of the live stream off the top of my head, but you can check our events calendar for that. But the Battle of Shiloh is, sees total casualties, in the tens of thousands, and this is often referred to as sort of, the loss of innocence in the Civil War, just the shocking casualty numbers that come to define the Civil War. We're right on the cusp of that at Pea Ridge, but we're not quite there yet. That's not to say it's going to be a proverbial walk in the park, as we're going to see. Now, according to Surgeon D.L. McGugan, which is just a delightful name. He's a Union surgeon from the 3rd Iowa Cavalry, and he leaves behind our most detailed account of the medical situation surrounding Pea Ridge. According to Surgeon D.L. McGugan, the commissary wagons and supplies that were supposed to come to the Union Army, which was operating in Arkansas, all the way from Rolla, Missouri, which was a couple hundred miles away, would often get captured by guerrilla bands and other irregular forces, some of Confederate loyalty, some of no loyalty in particular, just taking advantage of the fact that these supply trains would be lightly guarded. So it was tough to get supplies to the Union Army in the field, and so they had to subsist on the nutrients and food and such that was around them, in their area. Now, General Sherman becomes famous or infamous for this sort of technique later in the war, living off the land, waging a hard war, as historian Mark Grimsley calls it. Basically to discourage, take all the war-making capacity of the surrounding countryside and the Confederate citizenry. There's not that same sort of calculated assault on Confederate crops and things of that nature. It's more born out of necessity here, but we start to see some foreshadowing of what we will see on a much larger scale much later in the war. Now, when the battle began on the night of March 6th, 1862, the Union Army under General Samuel Curtis, also known as the Army of the Southwest, was dangerously low on medical supplies. Their nearest stockpile was in St. Louis, Missouri, which is, as you can see here, a whole state away, about 300 miles away, to be precise. The head surgeon of the Army of the Southwest, the Union Army, Surgeon W.C. Otterson, had gone there to resupply, to get more medical supplies to the front back in early February, so a month ago. It takes a month at least to get from point A to get from St. Louis to Pea Ridge. That's going to come into play later. But he had not yet returned when the fighting broke out. So this means two things. Number one, there's limited medical supplies on hand. And number two, the Union medical director is not there to coordinate the medical response. And this is going to have some consequences. Here's just a rough map. I won't go into too many details about the battle, primarily because I wouldn't call myself an expert on the Battle of Pea Ridge. If you have detailed questions about that, I would refer you to the National Park Service site about the kind of tactical X's and O's. But broadly speaking, as you can see here, the Confederate Army, who is initiating this battle, is coming actually from the north. The hope is to encircle or at least prevent the retreat further north of the Union Army. So they come from the town of Bentonville, Arkansas, which is nearby. They come from the west, and they kind of come and get in the rear of the Union position, which you can see kind of at the bottom of the screen. They were initially facing south. They were on this riverbank on some high bluffs, a very strong defensive position if the enemy is coming at you, from the south. But in this case, Van Dorn and the Confederates come from the north. There's some skirmishing on the night of March 6th. Very little combat happens that day. March 7 is kind of an all-day battle, and it takes place in two kind of separate locations. One on the outskirts of Leetown, which you see kind of on the left of your screen there, or the center left. And there's kind of one section of the battle. The other part of the battle taking place on the right side of the screen at Elkhorn Tavern. And so they're kind of in many ways separate actions. Overnight, the armies regroup and battle resumes on March 8th at Elkhorn Tavern, and the battle wraps up pretty much by 11 a.m. on the second day with a Union victory. The Confederates began retreating. So, and here's a Harper's Weekly sketch of one of the final assaults, the Battle of Pea Ridge. Now, when the wounded started streaming to the rear during the first full day of battle on March 7, the surgeons needed a place to treat them. And that's the dilemma at any battle. You want to treat soldiers, you want them to have a roof over their head to protect them from the elements, either intense sunlight, warmth or precipitation or cold or whatever. You want to get them some shelter. But that proves to be an issue when the largest settlement near the battlefield, Leetown, like I mentioned before, the fact that we're on the American frontier meant that the largest settlement only contains somewhere between 15 to 20 single-story buildings. So there just isn't a lot of space. Union Surgeon D.L. McGugan wrote that Leetown, quote, contained but few of the ordinary domestic appliances and were wholly wanting in the usual necessaries found in more settled regions. And this is coming from someone who lives in Iowa, not exactly the paragon of bustling metropolises and such. No offense to anyone watching from Iowa, but back in the 19th century, Iowa, wasn't exactly the city capital of the world either. And so even this Iowa surgeon is remarking on the kind of bare bones nature of the situation in Leetown, Arkansas. McGugan went on to report that, quote, all the houses within 3 miles of the battlefield were taken for hospitals. Some of these sheltered both our own wounded and those of the enemy. There just simply weren't enough buildings, as we'll see as we go along here. In addition to having no kitchens or outhouses, Leetown was not particularly close to a source of fresh water. McGugan wrote, quote, we were forced to bring water in casks from the creek a half a mile distant. So imagine having to carry water for half a mile for thousands of wounded soldiers. It ends up becoming quite a chore. Now here's a map which is included in the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. I have added these circles here for clarity. They denote the locations of field hospitals during and after the battle itself. And I don't know how easy it is to see on your screen, but the ones with clear flags, the not filled in flags, are federal field hospitals. The ones with darkened flags are Confederate field hospitals, and the ones with sort of double shading are both Union and Confederate field hospitals. And so Leetown, the large circle you see on the left there, that was sort of a mixture of both sides. The Confederate field hospitals are kind of along the top of your screen there. And then Union field hospitals more so on the right-hand side, kind of along that road. Because the Battle of Pea Ridge took place in a remarkably inaccessible area, the typical medical regulations for proper space per patient and cleanliness could not be followed. And I can hear the question forming in your minds, but John, surely there were no medical regulations about proper space per patient or cleanliness during the Civil War, right? Well, you'd be wrong on that account. They're enforced and followed pretty irregularly at the beginning of the conflict, but as time goes on, in hospitals, especially more so in general hospitals, which are behind the lines in cities, not in combat zones, places like St. Louis, Boston, Philadelphia, Richmond, Atlanta, etc. They do, require, and I'm blanking on what the number is off the top of my head, but patients were required to have a certain amount of square footage to themselves. They don't want to put them too close together. Social distancing. They're not thinking about it in those terms, and they're not even maybe necessarily sure why it works, but they seem to note over time that there are better patient outcomes, when they are a little bit spaced out. And likewise, there are cleanliness standards that emerge during the Civil War. They're mostly administered because, there's something about, it's good presentation to be clean. They're not thinking about it in terms of the health benefits, but over time they notice that it leads to better recoveries. So they, require that patients, their clothes, their bed sheets be cleaned on a regular basis. Here, though, on the frontier, in the midst of a combat zone, all that's out the window. And just to paint a picture of what Leetown was like, McGugan wrote that, quote, at Leetown, I was soon engaged with Surgeon D.W. Young of the 36th Illinois and several other medical officers in attending the wounded. In a building formerly occupied as a small store, the wounded were brought in more rapidly than there was room for their reception. This building would accommodate only about 35 patients, yet it had a greater capacity than any other building in the village. So 35 people is the largest of these 15 to 20 buildings that they're working with here. So again, not a lot of space. Now, they are pitching hospital tents in the, outside in between buildings. So there is, some amount of shelter. Now, hospital tents, every regiment was required to have at least one or two, and these are fairly large tents, capable of holding, somewhere between 6 and 8 wounded soldiers at a time. So there are some other supplemental housing that they're able to deploy, but it's still not quite enough. As I've mentioned before, some buildings, there's both Union and Confederate troops being treated here. Some buildings are only for Confederate troops, some are only from Union, and some are both Union and Confederate. And to the extent that Confederate surgeons were captured, and McGugan does write about a few captured Confederate surgeons, they were assigned to work with Confederate patients. We'll talk a bit as we go along about treatment of enemy wounded, treatment of wounded from the other side. So we'll circle back to that, but it makes sense that if you have Confederate surgeons, if you're the Union Medical Department, have them work on Confederate patients. It just kind of makes sense. After the first day of combat, surgeons were already overwhelmed by the lack of supplies and by the vast number of wounded. But of course, we know, and they didn't, though they probably suspected, another day of battle is yet to come. During the night of March 7, while both armies prepared for the final day of battle, the medical corps fought to save lives. McGugan recorded that the surgeons, quote, where they were fortunate enough to procure lights, proceeded with their work, and few, if any of them, slept. So they're working all through the night, even if it's just that they stabilize certain patients and open up space for other people that need shelter more urgently. There's so many different calculuses all happening at once here. You see here, fighting on March 8 resulted in a Union victory. The Confederate Army in full retreat. The battlefield and its wounded were left in the hands of Union forces. Orders soon went out for Union surgeons to begin taking care of the enemy's wounded remaining on the field. Our army stampeded and left us here with our sick and wounded men, wrote a Confederate surgeon left behind to care for his army's wounded. He goes on, for 2 days, we had nothing to give our poor fellows but parched corn and water. Every Federal officer and man has treated us like gentlemen, and General Curtis, the Union commander, told me that so long as he had a loaf of bread, we should have half of it, end quote. When Confederate soldiers were wounded and thus no longer a threat, it was not uncommon for Union medical authorities to look after them in this way, and vice versa. And a number of people comment on the kind of the treatment, that the Union surgeons went out of their way to do what they could to help the Confederate patients. Now, warm and fuzzy stories like this of cooperation and things of that nature were not, universal throughout the Civil War. It's a challenging subject to talk about just because it's different in every situation. So the Civil War kind of predates what you might call formal laws of war or rules of war, to the extent that, such a thing, those sorts of things can really be enforced. The Libra Code comes out in 1863. That gets a lot of press. It's designed by or written by someone named Francis Lieber, adopted by the Union Army. But it's hard to say, and this is before the Libra Code, but even after that gets introduced, it's hard to say, what someone on a battlefield in rural Arkansas, these decisions on how to do war and treat wounded soldiers are really pretty individual. Now the Army commanders, have a lot of sway here, but on the ground, they come down to individual colonels, individual surgeons, and things like that. So it's tough to say exactly how this all, sort of gets enforced. There's a lot of, good press at a battle like Pea Ridge, where the the surgeons work together, to try and help all the wounded. There are less favorable stories, just anecdotally from the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg. A Union nurse that I've studied extensively, Clara Jones, she talks about how the volunteer, the volunteer nurses and such who are attending the wounded, who are Union volunteers, they don't pay any attention to the Confederate soldiers. The surgeons give them sort of a once over, and that's that. It's hard to say how common it was, but my larger point is here that while there's sort of a pretty rosy picture actually in the aftermath of the Battle of Pea Ridge, that's certainly not always the case. And there's a great blog post on our blog written by our very own Kyle Dalton, what he calls the Triage of Allegiance, which I think is an interesting title, where he details in greater detail than I can for you here about how both sides would approach the issue of enemy wounded. And of course, the introduction of USCTs, United States Colored Troops, definitely adds a further wrinkle into the fact that Confederates are not as apt to want to treat wounded Black soldiers. So there's that wrinkle as well. You're probably more inclined to treat people from your side, especially if you know them. So there's all kinds of things that are at play here. And when we, it's so easy, when we're asked the question, oh, did they treat the enemy's wounded? It's easy to say yes. And in many cases they did. I think it was probably more common that both sides treated the enemy's wounded, with the same or similar priority to their own than it was that they didn't. But I'm certainly not gonna come on here and say that it was sunshine and roses, and as soon as someone was wounded, both sides immediately went to go aid the person. So it's kind of a complex question to answer, and one that we get a lot here. And I think this, these descriptors, the Confederate surgeon saying, reporting that General Curtis said that as long as he had a loaf of bread, we should have half of it. I have no doubt that that happened, but it does paint an awfully rosy picture. And so I just wanted to kind of have that aside there. But for all this goodwill, again, the fact remains that they're low on supplies and they're low on shelter. Union surgeon Herschel Felton, sergeant, not surgeon, Herschel Felton of the 37th Illinois described the aftermath of the Battle of Pea Ridge, writing, quote, "It was an awful sight to see the dead and wounded lying about the hospitals. Some were alive that had been shot through the head. I saw 13 of our regiment lying in one pile 2 deep. They were burying all the time for 2 days." So not a great situation. Now, what to do with all of these wounded soldiers? As I've mentioned before, there's just no place for them to be. So the pressing question is what to do with the approximately 2,500 wounded soldiers, of both sides, without the necessary resources. Soon after the battle, as many wounded soldiers as could be transported via wagon, those that were safe to be moved by wagon, were ordered to Cassville, which you can see on the map. So you got Pea Ridge at the far south there. Cassville, not too far across the border into Missouri. But Cassville, and this is to alleviate the overcrowding in Leetown. That's about a 20-mile journey that took about 3 or 4 days to complete over roads of exceedingly poor quality. Cassville provided conditions a little better than those seen at Leetown, however. It too is a small town on the far western frontier of the United States. It was a bit bigger than Leetown, but not incredibly so. And so it's just, they're looking for basically any city of any size, and Cassville happens to be the next closest. Just to kind of briefly hit the other points on the map here, Springfield, Missouri, is where wounded soldiers from the Battle of Wilson's Creek were taken. Battle of Wilson's Creek happens just a little bit south of town, and that's another 80 or so miles further, and that was a decent sized city. If you could make it there, you'd be in a little bit better shape. St. Louis, of course, is the ultimate objective for these people. St. Louis is where the purpose-built hospitals are that can accommodate thousands of patients. There where soldiers should be going for long-term recovery, but St. Louis, as I mentioned earlier, is 300 miles away from the Pea Ridge battlefield, and really, so it's not particularly close. Now, Rolla, Missouri on there, that's the closest railhead to St. Louis. So if you want to make it to St. Louis, you just need to make it to Rolla or Rolla. I'm not sure which. I'm sure I'm pronouncing it wrong both ways somehow. But in any case, as you can clearly see, none of this is terribly close to Pea Ridge. And even Cassville, more space, you're still not where you'd like to be. So Cassville represented the best medical care most of the wounded men would get. Like I said, St. Louis is too far away. Rolla is 250 miles away. And Springfield about 80 miles away. And of course, over all of this, to get from anywhere here, you're traveling over very poor roads, which is of course brutally uncomfortable if you've just been shot, or maybe you've just had an amputation performed, things of that nature. And there are kind of guerrilla bands marauding here, there, and everywhere. So your journey, you're never really safe from harm, no matter where you are in Southwest Missouri. But by March 25th, things start to take a turn. More than 2 weeks after the battle, agents and supplies from the Western Sanitary Commission began arriving at Cassville and other nearby hospitals in large quantities. They provided desperately needed medical supplies, bedding, clean clothes to those convalescing from battlefield injury and disease. So suddenly supplies start coming before, around March 25th. A Western Sanitary Commission agent who arrived in Cassville described the scene. He wrote, quote, "The next day, the 25th, I arrived at Cassville. Here I found 2 large tents, 6 buildings, among them the courthouse and the tavern, used as hospitals. The patients were lying on the floors with a little straw under them and with knapsacks or blankets under their heads for pillows. They had no comforts of any kind, no change of clothes, but were lying in the clothes they fought in, stiff and dirty with blood and soil. There were 400 federal wounded here. There were a great deficiency of nurses, detailed men not answering the purpose well." And brief aside, the detailed men, these are wounded soldiers who had recovered enough that they could assist the surgeon in the role of nurse. So the nursing profession doesn't exist at the beginning of the Civil War, and to the extent, and people say, frequently, we get the question sometimes, were there any male nurses? The answer is that actually most nurses were male, and the majority of those people being recovering soldiers or recently wounded soldiers who are kind of pinch hitting, as it were. They're not trained, they're not even necessarily any good, but they're there, which especially in a case like this, just being there is vitally important. So that's what that reference is. The Western Sanitary Commission agent goes on. Let me see. Great deficiency of nurses, detailed men not answering the purpose very well. Their sheets had been torn up for bandages, and until Dr. Otterson reached there with his supplies, they were poorly furnished with medicines. Stimulants were very much needed to sustain the sinking men, but none were to be had. There were no brooms to sweep with and no mops to wash the rooms. Your stores here turned over to the brigade surgeon, who opened and distributed them to the different hospitals. Never was a provision train more joyously greeted by starving men than was this ample supply of hospital stores by these sick and suffering soldiers. From there, the Western Sanitary Commission group went to the Pea Ridge battlefield itself to offer help to patients who couldn't be moved. And while there, they visited both Confederate and Union hospitals and encountered rebel surgeons who spoke highly of the treatment they had received from the Union surgeons in the Army. Following the Battle of Pea Ridge, the Union Medical Department and the Western Sanitary Commission worked to prevent a medical situation similar to Pea Ridge, where the Army was caught without adequate stockpiles of medical supplies or easy access to long-term care facilities. You know, that's an idealized goal, and at various points it wasn't perfectly met, but incidents like Pea Ridge, and we'd already sort of talked about it with Wilson's Creek, but that, even that, and the rural nature of the Battle of Wilson's Creek was an issue. In many ways, it didn't hold a candle to Pea Ridge in terms of how barren of both facilities and supplies they were. So I mean, that's a goal for them to work for, and for the most part, throughout the remainder of the Civil War, in the Western theater, you don't see too many kind of disasters akin to Pea Ridge. And that's a combination of the establishment of more hospitals, armies being required to carry more supplies on a regular basis, and things of that nature, and the medical department and citizen relief organizations just being better at what they do. Simply just repetition ends up helping out immensely. While the medical care in rural Missouri and Arkansas could not match that seen in the Eastern Theater, and never really did, by 1864, more than 70 hospitals had been opened in the region that you see here on this map, well, a little bit wider than this, but in this region, to offer some degree of long-term care, better care to sick and wounded soldiers. Now, all of this, the similar issues that are dealt with at Pea Ridge come back, not as viciously, but they do come back at the next major battle in the Western Theater, which I'll be talking about a month from now, the Battle of Shiloh. And so we'll see the unique challenges they deal with there. And the most important of all the things that will change is the scale goes up. And that's going to be a huge change. Now, you remember we talked about the last one of these that I did about the Battle of Fort Donelson, that there's some sort of tentative progress towards what goes on to become the Letterman system, this kind of efficient way of evacuating wounded soldiers from the battlefields, ambulances, people going forward with the men, ambulances quickly getting soldiers off the battlefield. We don't have that at this battle, because this is a different army altogether than the army that Grant's in command of. And like I mentioned, there's just not the same sort of supplies, and the medical director isn't present at this battle. He's off acquiring more supplies. So those are the sort of the reasons why we don't see kind of notable medical progress to battlefield evacuation at this battle. So stay tuned for those. We're going to see some more signs of improvement at the Battle of Shiloh. So stay tuned for that. That's most of what I have to say here about Pea Ridge. Go ahead and drop your questions in the comments. Let me know what you enjoyed, what I didn't address, what you want to hear more about. It's a lot to take in for sure. So now I'm going to go back through the comments. I see I've still got 84 of you watching with me. That's great. Thank you for sticking around. And I see we got someone, I hope I don't mispronounce your name, Zuil from Campeche, Mexico. That's very exciting. Glad to have you here. Oh my, Valerie tuning in from Germany. Wow, we got a lot of people from all over the world. Someone from Greece. Wow, how cool. Dean tuning in. Always good to be with you, Dean. Tracy asked, what was the date of the battle? Hopefully you got that, but March 6th through 8th, 1862, the Battle of Pea Ridge was. And if any of you tuned in late and are wondering if you will be able to go back and watch this from the beginning, the answer is yes. These videos will continue to exist on our Facebook page, eventually our YouTube channel. See, Rick says, I actually own a book talking about the medical procedures and medicines at Wilson's Creek Battlefield, which is worth owning. It certainly sounds like it. That sounds like a winner. I'd love to consult that sometime. Let's see, Laura Lee from sunny Michigan. Let's see here. Richard says Pea Ridge is remarkably preserved in part because there are less people living around it than there were in 1862. Yeah, I imagine that that's true. Yeah, that's my memory from when I was out there. And when I say out there, I mean it's out there. So I'm certain that helps. Lynn, who has been a faithful viewer of us throughout the past year, asked, John, how populated is this area of Arkansas by Native Americans? To the point, how often, if ever, were Native American medicinals borrowed / used in therapies on the remote Western Front, much less assistance by the natives? That's a great question, Lynn. And I regret to say that I don't know the answer. The native population and American settlers, I think, were frequently at odds with each other. But at the same time, I'm aware that frontier realities may not always conform to that the neat historical narrative that we have. So I would not be shocked if Native American medicines, remedies, therapies, etc., were borrowed. I would have to guess, though, that in the military, we probably wouldn't see as much of that with Confederate and Union surgeons. In more civilian medicine, I could see that would be common, but these are surgeons coming from Missouri, Texas, Arkansas, in the case of the Union Army, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Missouri. Not that, of course, that there aren't native peoples there, but probably less common. And if you're a military doctor, probably a little bit less of a cultural conversation in that front. But it's a great question and one I wish I knew more about. Man, I always forget how exhausting it is to talk for 45, 50 minutes straight. It's easier when I have a guest on. I can let them do most of the talking. Chris asked a question, did any of the soldiers here fight at Antietam as well? I don't definitively know the answer to that. I would say for the most part, I know for the most part, most of them do not, if not all. It's certainly possible that some do, but this is why, for example, the Iron Brigade is such an unusual unit in the Eastern Theater. There are not a lot of Midwestern regiments. Making up the Union Army at this battle, a lot of soldiers from Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, things of that nature. There's just not a lot of those units in the Eastern Theater, and that's why the Iron Brigade is partially such a novelty out there. And likewise with the Confederate forces, a lot of soldiers from Texas, Arkansas, Missouri. You don't see too many of those in the Army of Northern Virginia. So I'm certainly not saying nobody that fought in the Battle of Pea Ridge also fought at the Battle of Antietam, but that number is very small. I'm sure few, if any, units did. Annie McDevitt asks, early in the Civil War, there were exchanges of captured officers or physicians commonly exchanged by the combatants early in the war. It's a tough question that I kind of struggle with sometimes. There's a particularly famous story, and we have a great blog post about this on our website about the Winchester Accords. There's at the First Battle of Winchester with Stonewall Jackson, his surgeon Hunter Holmes McGuire Confederates win the battle. They capture a lot of Union surgeons, but they need their help to treat the wounded. And so they draw up what they call the Winchester Accords, and basically it kind of gives surgeons non-combatant status, and that they won't be taken as prisoners. And sometimes when we talk about it, we hold it up as like this becomes the new paradigm with how both armies deal with captured surgeons. But at the same time, we also know of surgeons that end up in prisoner of war camps. So how pervasive was it really? And that's why I had that whole tangent on laws of war and how they did or didn't exist. It's hard to say. Like, for example, one of the surgeons from a Western theater battle, Surgeon Wooden, I think is his name, from an Indiana regiment. He's captured at the Battle of Chickamauga and ends up in Libby prison. According to the Winchester Accords, that shouldn't happen, but it does. So it's hard to say. We have some anecdotal evidence here and there, but we don't have as clear a picture as maybe I would wish. Maybe that's something we really should just kind of really turn our research gaze towards. It's an interesting topic and one that I don't have a very satisfying answer for you. Jan asks, what was the complement of hospital stewards for each of the field hospitals? Great question, Jan. The short answer is I don't know. In an ideal world, for every surgery that you perform, and they are performing a number of surgeries at these field hospitals, you would have 3 doctors. And you obviously want to have more than 3 doctors on hand so you can do more than one surgery at a time. You want people directing people, where should the new arrivals go and stuff like that. So, you would think a top-notch field hospital that had all the bells and whistles, as it were, would have, tens of surgeons to kind of properly run things. But, in the midst of a battle, I have to imagine that was rarely seen. Each regiment would have somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 5 medical personnel. So, they'd be broken up, some going forward with the regiment, some staying near the regiment. So it's such a complex thing to kind of nail this down, especially during a battle. And in the aftermath of the battle, of course, it's all hands on deck. Surgeons are treating whoever is injured that they see in front of them. So it's just such a whirlwind. And that's why it's hard to pin down exact staffing numbers. It's a great question and not one that I have very good answers to. Lynn asks, is there evidence of guerrilla attacks or threats to Union hospitals in southern Missouri? I'm not an expert on that subject myself. My guess is there probably wouldn't be threats to hospitals, but that they might not be above taking medical supplies when they're en route from point A to point B from time to time. There is a great scholar who does work on kind of guerrilla bands and irregular army forces, in the Missouri area. And I, of course, am blanking on his name. It starts with an I, this person's name. Oh, shoot, I think they teach at the University of Georgia. Maybe someone can look this up for me. I'm going to look it up myself real quick. Doing it live here, everybody. So the short answer is I'm not sure. Let me see. It's not Stephen Barry. Oh boy. Oh well. Well, sorry, I couldn't help you a bit more with that one. Another Ryan says, add another to list I want to visit. Thanks for the great presentation. Glad you enjoyed, Ryan. Thanks for tuning in. Brenda from Alexandria, Louisiana. Love these broadcasts. They're so informative. Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. Fiddletown, California. I teach in Calaveras County, home of Mark Twain's famous jumping frog. Excellent. Richard says, after the battle, the 2 armies marched in opposite directions. Curtis headed southeast and occupied Helena, Arkansas, and the Mississippi. How about that? Rosemary asks, were Union and Confederate medical skills equally matched? Good question. In terms of skill, and it's kind of a tough question. In terms of skill, I would say they probably were pretty equally matched because they're going to a lot of the same schools before the Civil War. So they're, it's not unlike, it is a bit different because there's a few more options for medical schools, or well, a number more than military schools like West Point and VMI. There's Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia is one of the big ones, but there's also plenty of medical schools in the South as well. But the larger point I'm trying to make is they're getting the same sort of curriculum. So in terms of their skill, I think the medical departments were equally matched. Now, where sometimes the Confederate medical departments could fall short is in terms of how well they were supplied. That was, they were more evenly matched at the Battle of Pea Ridge because the Union were so low on supplies going into the battle. So with this particular battle, I think they probably were quite evenly matched, but not the case always at every battle. Scott says, super presentation, John. Thanks again. Thank you. Let's see. John Willen always jumps in to help me out when I need it. He's the best. John Willen talking about the Winchester Accords. He says they were suspended from June 1863 to October due to the incident with Dr. William Rucker. Not an incident I'm familiar with, but so it sounds like there was some, to the extent that they did set a precedent, it was suspended for a time. So the larger point that I think I've been trying to get at here is that, whenever there is some sort of agreement reached about, whether to treat surgeons as non-combatants, that agreement could be pretty tenuous. And at various times it was pretty touch and go. Let's see here. Frank asks, is there any chance you could explain for me the Libra Code and its importance? I spoke to it a little bit earlier, and again, I'm not an expert on this. I would point you to a book. It's called The Hard Hand of War by Mark Grimsley. That's where the best kind of explanation, in the context of a book that I've read. So that can do a better job than I can, but it's produced by a law scholar, Franz Lieber or Francis Lieber, can't remember which, but there are 100 different little kind of points about how armies, governments, citizenry, etc., should conduct themselves in a war, and it's really the foundation for kind of formalized laws of war as we know them today. I'm not as familiar, and I don't know, to what, and it was adopted by the Union Army in 1863. What I don't know is how, how it was enforced, or how widely it was, embraced by, soldiers on the ground or line commanders, things like that, or by the Confederacy, or, was it recognized by the Confederacy and things like that. So I can't speak to how pivotal the Libra Code was or wasn't. It's notable in like the history of the development of the laws of war and such, and it's definitely deserves to be mentioned and should be mentioned in any Civil War related conversation about that. But I just don't know enough to speak authoritatively about it. But that's a little thumbnail sketch for you, Frank. Let's see. Oh, thank you, Michael Schaefer, that UGA professor who does a lot of great work about guerrilla, warfare and such in the West. John Insco. I saw him speak once at the Civil War Institute. Really, really interesting presentation. Look up his work if you want to find out more information about, sort of guerrilla warfare in the Civil War. Laura Lee says, another informative presentation. We're so lucky to have live streams like these. Thank you. Glad you think that. And as we're coming to the end of our time here, I'll use that as a springboard to say, if you want to support programs like these, there are a few different ways you can do it. Number one, like this video, share this video, tag at least one friend. That helps us a ton. Like us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube, Follow us on all the social medias. You know, we're on Twitter, Instagram, we're even on Reddit. Anywhere you can imagine, that's where we are. So you can follow us. That's all free. All you got to do is make an account and follow us, like us, subscribe. You know, whatever the verbiage is. So that's something easy everyone can do to help us out. And we thank you to those of you who have. It's also a great way to stay up to date with what we're doing. If you want to take it another level and really kind of join us with what we do and be a part of this sort of thing, you can become a member of the museum. And there's a link for that in the comments. You can become a member. Membership money supports programs like these. And you can join for as little as $25 a year. It's about $2 and some change per month. So that would be a great way that you can support the museum, and we really appreciate it. And thank you to all of you who did tune in and who have already joined. So with that, I know there's a few more questions here. You know, people saying some nice things in the comments. Really appreciate that. I'll see you. A lot of people saying they're looking forward to Shiloh, so get excited about that. I'll be back sooner than that, though, on Wednesday. Today is International Women's Day, which we postponed talking about women in the Civil War until Wednesday. You know, since today is also the anniversary of Pea Ridge. But I'm going to be back with Dr. Stephanie McCurry talking about her book, Women's War. It should be a really, really good conversation. I know I'm personally excited to talk with her. She's a fantastic scholar, and that should be a really excellent presentation. So tune in Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern for more. And with that, I'll be signing off here today. So thank you for being with me today. I had a lot of fun. I hope you did as well, and we'll see you next time.